Hello and welcome to Game Trek. My name is Chris, and this is Monster Hunter World. By now, most of you have probably heard of this game. It sold over 7.5 million copies and has drawn in many new players for the series. It is a fantastic game with great gameplay, graphics, and of course, monsters. This game is full of unique designs and interesting fights that it's hard not to get excited when you get into this game. But if you're like me, then when you see these monsters, you probably wonder what the thought behind each monster was. What was it that led to each of these monsters and their crazy and cool designs? I'm going to break this video up into 3 parts: visual and audio design, their movements and fighting styles, and their interactions with the environment. So strap in as I talk about the world of Monster Hunter.
See what I did there? It's funny because it's the name of the game.
First off, a lot of these monsters have very distinct outlines, which set them apart from each other. You can very easily tell them apart in the heat of battle, which is important, because once you see a monster, you need to be able to recognize what you're going up against so you can successfully hunt it or run away from it, depending on the situation. There are a few monsters that have very similar outlines, such as Rathalos and Rathian, but with them, and most others, their colors are strikingly different, so you can tell when it's one or the other. You can also tell via their roars. Each are distinct enough to where when you've heard them a few times, you can most often tell which monster it comes from. For example, the Legiana's roar is not as booming or intense as one like Nergigante's. Speaking of Nergigante, I want to go a bit more specifically into its visual inspirations. Though this may seem surprising to you, a lot of its inspirations, at least visually, come from porcupines. Now, I know what you're thinking.
Chris, that's a dragon. How's that in any way related to a porcupine?
Well, that's what I'm here to talk about. You see, Nergigante's gimmick is that when you've wailed on him enough, he'll break his old spikes and grow new ones. So check 1 for porcupine. But that's not where the similarities end. There are plenty of animals that have spiky parts. Why isn't it a hedgehog, for example? Well, that comes down to the coloration of the spikes and the way in which both of them detach so easily. First off, if you look at a Nergigante spikes, you'll notice that it's mostly white with a black tip, where porcupine quills are also mostly black and white. Another thing is that porcupine quills are known to come off quite easily, which has led to the legend that they can shoot their spikes out to defend themselves. Nergigante's spikes act in a similar manner, though his use of them is far more aggressive than a porcupine's. During a hunt, Nergigante tends to break off its quills and send them flying at you when it smashes its fists or head into the ground, obviously taking inspiration from the myth of porcupines being able to shoot their quills. There's even a cutscene that shows its spikes lodged into another monster, similar to how porcupine's quills lodge into other animals. Though it's never been confirmed, I feel there is a lot of evidence in its visual design, pointing to the fact that Nergigante is just a big, angry porcupine that eats dragons. But that's enough about visual design. Now we have to ask, how does a monster fight? I feel like at this point it would be a good idea to mention how the dev team for this game did a lot to get these movements to look realistic. They released a video of them going to the pet store to study how lizards moved so that they could get the movements of the monsters to look realistic. And boy does it show. Monsters such as Great Jagras and Anjanath really show this with their movements. Both of these monsters feel real. It seems as though this is exactly how a behemoth of this size would move. Monsters such as Anjanath use their brute strength and size to win a fight, whereas monsters like Rathalos and Legiana use flight and their respective elements to take down their foes. Each of these have their fair share of originality in how they fight and move. Even monsters such as Rathalos and Rathian, who look very similar, have two different attacking styles. Like I mentioned earlier, Rathalos is a big fan of staying in the air, and he uses a lot more breath attacks and talon swipes, due to the fact that he is flying, where Rathian tends to stay on the ground and use its teeth and tail. So in broad terms, how a monster fights and moves is important to understanding its inspirations and design. But how about we look deeper into a certain monster who happens to be my favorite, Tobi-Kadachi. Let's do a case study. Tobi-Kadachi certainly is an interesting monster, with one of the most unique designs in the game being almost a mishmash of different creatures. First, let's look at how he moves through his environment. The way he strides through the forest almost reminds me of a panther. He keeps his head low, with his legs keeping a steady pace. He only lifts his head when he stops to survey his environment, looking for prey or hunters. You can also see itself rubbing against trees in its environment. This is so it can build up static electricity that it uses in its attacks. Now, onto its fighting style. If you couldn't tell by its appearance, Tobi-Kadachi is a fast, agile fighter. It uses its claws to climb up into the trees in its environment to attack from above with its tail. Here's where another one of its animal inspirations comes in. Tobi-Kadachi has a membrane between its legs, which it can use to glide for short periods of time, like the flying squirrel. It uses this membrane to glide between trees to get the drop on its opponents or to deliver a devastating tail whip. It can also use all sorts of flips and can dart around the battlefield at high speeds. I would also like you to notice that it never really uses its claws, as they are more for climbing rather than fighting. And this concludes our case study. So yeah, that is just a look into one of the many crazy fights you can see in Monster Hunter. Like I said earlier, Tobi-Kadachi is one of my favorites. Now I feel it is time to get on to our last topic, the environment. Now this is one of the aspects of World that I think is nailed the most, the environment. In truth, I could probably do an entire video on the environment of this game and how it feels like a living, breathing ecosystem. But we're here to specifically talk about how the monsters interact with it. And with this, I feel like the most important thing to mention is the scout flies. These things are your main guide in helping find the monster via tracks and other signs indicating the monster you are searching for. There are many different ways that these monsters leave their marks on the world, but for my purposes, I will focus on the specific signs of Anjanath and Rathalos, mostly because they are the easiest monsters to observe, leaving their specified marks. First, the Anjanath likes to mark its territory with mucus. If you use your ghillie mantle and follow the Anjanath around, you can notice it doing this as it surveys its territory. This gives the Anjanath a bit more of the feel of a living creature instead of some boss you just have to fight in the game. It breathes life into this behemoth of a creature. Next is Rathalos, who also leaves his mark on the world, but in a slightly different way. If you head up to the area where Rathalos' nest is, you notice that there's these large gashes in the wood. These are left by Rathalos when they sharpen their claws. It's the tiny details like this that really makes certain games for me. The fact that Rathalos does this makes it seem more like a predator preparing for its next hunt. And even the fact that afterwards, these gashes show up in the wood is great within itself. That is not the only way that Rathalos interacts with his environment. At his roost, there is a wall near the top that is holding back a big flood of water. If you can trick Rathalos into hitting it with either a fire breath or another heavy hitting move, it will knock the wall loose, letting forth a torrent of water. and if Rathalos is caught in it, he'll be washed off the nearby cliff, which damages him and leaves him open to attack for quite some time. With things like this, fights become more dynamic and allow the player to think about how they can use the environment to their advantage, adding another layer of strategy and fun to the battle. There's also the factor of turf wars. These are special animations that play when two certain monsters go up against each other in the middle of a hunt, such as the one with Rathalos and Anjanath. This adds another layer to the pot, which makes the game feel like, well, a world. And I must admit how fantastic the game is at adding these ways to use the environment to your advantage. Like you can get monsters to knock down certain trees that have these vine traps that they can get stuck in, or you can kick this toad that spits out a paralyzing gas. Take this. Or how if you hit these pterodactyl type things with your slinger, they'll scream and make the diablos come out of the ground and wreck whatever monster you're fighting. Okay, that was a bit of a side tangent, but you get the idea I'm trying to get across, right? The environment is well designed and more than just pretty scenery like it is in a lot of other games. Monster Hunter World is a fantastic game that you should all buy if you haven't already, because the design and care behind it is enough to warrant at least a look at. For me, I'm a big nerd when it comes to video game design, and I love to talk about it. When a game that has good design behind it comes along, I love to look into why the game works so well, and Monster Hunter is no exception. For those of you that have the game, I hope this video has deepened your appreciation of the game. Maybe made you want to look at any other neat design aspects that I might have not mentioned in this video. For those of you that don't have the game, how have you made it this far? I mean, I appreciate it, but it may have been hard to understand since I talked about a lot of stuff that you'd have to have played the game to know. But still, if you made it this far in the video, thank you. And maybe this video has convinced you to buy the game, or at least appreciate the thought that goes into it. Well, I've been Chris, and I want to thank you for coming on this journey with me, and I'll see you in the next video.